Good morning. This is our fourth in our mini-series going through the Book of Jonah. If you've been with us over the last 3 days, you've seen some of the themes already that are coming out of the Book of Jonah. We have the central character, the man Jonah. And we see that he is the worst man just by his reaction to the call of God and what God lays on his heart to do. He seems to be the worst man given the mission to the worst people, to the people, the Assyrians. We learned how he was given a mission by God to speak of God's judgment on the Assyrian people. And rather than do what God called him to do, Jonah runs away. We mentioned the fact that oftentimes when we talk about Jonah, we talk about him in terms of running out of fear. And one of the things I told you in one of our sessions is that we are going to unpack what motivates Jonah, and that it was not fear that caused him to disobey God and run in the opposite direction. Now, yesterday we learned about his journey that he took going to Tarshish. On a ship, of course, he's trying to run from the presence of God to get as far away from the land of Israel and from his mission in Nineveh as he possibly can get. So instead of going east, obeying God, he heads west to get away from God. And then we encountered how God hurls a storm upon the ship that's carrying Jonah, and how the people on the ship all begin to cry out to their gods, hoping that one of them can be appeased and one of them will free them from what looks like impending doom. We read about how the captain encounters Jonah asleep down in the hold of the ship and calls out to him why he's not calling out to his God, and asks him who he is, where he's come from. And Jonah makes a declaration about God. Jonah says that his God is the God of the heavens, that his God is the God who made the seas and the dry lands. This is a huge declaration for Jonah to make in a time and a culture where most people's view of gods, they were local, and their power was often specific to a particular thing. Maybe you had the God of the mountains, or the God of the sky, or the God of the sea. But Jonah makes a declaration, what he has learned as being part of the children of Israel, that his God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his God is the God who has made the heavens and the earth. This is a declaration acknowledging the power of God. We also see from Jonah's reaction to what is happening, Jonah's understanding of the justice of God. Because when Jonah realizes that this storm has come upon them because of his disobedience, he believes that if God can judge him, God will free the others. He's the one who's committed the sin. He's the one who's run from the presence of God. Therefore, he's the one that deserves God's wrath. So last day when we were together, we looked at verse 11, and it says in chapter 1 of Jonah, "Then they said to him, 'What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?' For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, 'Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, and the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you.' Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, 'O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you.' So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows." So one of the things that we see coming out of this moment is Jonah's acknowledgement of the Lord's justice. He has sinned. He deserves wrath. He accepts this. And he tells the men, look, throw me over into the sea and I'll die. God's justice will be satisfied. You'll probably be free. You'll be safe. The men don't want to do this. They don't want to take Jonah's life, so they try in their own strength to find a way to get out of the storm, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse. They are not able to somehow get past what's going on. So finally, they realize this, and they cry out to God saying, what we're about to do, don't hold it to our account, please. What we're about to do. And they throw Jonah into the sea. And we're told the moment they throw Jonah into the sea, the storm stops. The moment Jonah is in the sea and not on the ship is no longer threatened. And so for all these men on this ship, all these sailors, now they have gained one more understanding of the God of Jonah. That the God of Jonah is just. Because the storm stops when they do what Jonah calls them to do. Now they only have a small picture of God. Their picture is limited because they've had limited exposure probably to the God who owns the sea and the dry land, who made all these things. What happens next is important. Remember, Jonah knows he sinned. Jonah believes in God's justice. Jonah expects God's wrath. Jonah assumes death is the result. You break God's law, you deserve death. Jonah accepts this. When Jonah is cast into the sea, Jonah fully expects that he's about to die. What happens next becomes huge, because what happens next is God's way of expanding Jonah's personal understanding of God's nature. And it's important for Jonah's understanding of the nature of God to increase in order for Jonah to be effective in doing what God is calling him to do. So in probably one of the most famous images that we have in this story, we see what comes next. In verse 17 of chapter 1, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish. For 3 days and 3 nights. So I want you to think on this. Jonah is on the ship. He knows that he deserves God's wrath. He knows that God's justice demands death. The wages of sin is death. Jonah, being cast into the sea, expects that the sea will take his life. He's in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. He doesn't expect he's getting away. And suddenly at that moment, as he enters the sea, we come to the first of God's great appointments. The first appointment. Now, these appointments are special, divine actions that God is using to reveal himself. So God appoints a fish. And this fish swallows up Jonah and takes Jonah in itself, we're told, for 3 days and 3 nights. The symbolism of this is huge. Jonah expected death. He expected to go into the sea and to die. Suddenly he's swallowed by this fish. Imagine for a moment being inside the belly of this fish in total, utter blackness, in stench, in confinement, trapped in there. It seems like death, but it isn't. Because the fish, rather than being death for Jonah, is actually his salvation. The fish saves him from death in the sea. It is an example of God's saving work for Jonah. Jonah expects death. He receives life through this divine appointment. Let's take a moment and just look at what Jonah says as he's in the fish. In Jonah chapter 2, then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish. I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land, whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. As we look at that passage, there's very powerful images in the language that Jonah uses. There's powerful images of death and the grave, of where he expected he was going, where it seemed like he was. But then there's this idea that he cried out to the Lord in his distress, and the Lord saved him. The Lord heard him, not because of goodness in Jonah, but because of the promises and the covenants of a God who keeps his word. That a God who is merciful, a God who extends life when it should be death. Jonah's understanding of the nature of God is played out. He begins to grasp that other side. See, Jonah had no problem before this and was probably supportive of the Lord's justice, the punishment for sin, for death. That made sense to Jonah. Now he's wrestling with, through this divine appointment of this fish, where there should be death, there's the opportunity for life. Why does God do this to Jonah? What is God teaching Jonah? What does he want Jonah to take from this? Remember, I said that Jonah was probably the worst man sent to deliver a message to the worst people. Well, God takes this worst man, Jonah, and puts him in the worst place possible. In the belly of the fish, in the depths of the sea, in the sense of the grave. And then he's going to call him up out of it. Call him up out of it. Take him from the place he deserves to a place he receives because of grace. The fish is our first picture of grace. I hope this has encouraged you. Stay tuned tomorrow for the next part as we take Jonah's journey and continue on to see what God teaches him through this and what God charges him with. Remember, I said one message, 3 appointments. This is the first one, the fish. 2 questions. The Lord bless you. If this was a help to you today, I encourage you to share it with somebody else so that it can benefit them too. Thank you.